Hi, I'm the history guy. I have a degree in history. I love history. If you love history too, this is the channel for you. Today is St. Patrick's Day, and while St. Patrick's Day is a little bit mainstream for a discussion on a channel that's dedicated to forgotten history, there are some forgotten bits of history associated with St. Patrick's Day that are really interesting. So let's start with the man himself, St. Patrick. We really don't know that much about St. Patrick. It's long enough ago that the record is sparse, and much of what we think we know is very difficult to actually prove. What is generally accepted is that he was a Romano-British missionary in Ireland in the 5th century AD, and that he played an important role in the conversion of Ireland from paganism to Catholicism. He's sometimes called the father of Christianity in Ireland, but there is some dispute about whether he was the first significant Christian missionary there, although it's unquestionable that he played a large role in the conversion of Ireland. Importantly, if you didn't know this, he was not himself born in Ireland. He was British. It might also surprise you to find out that St. Patrick was never actually canonized by a pope. For most of the first 1,000 years of the Catholic Church, there was no specific process for canonization. It was a local decision who to venerate. The popes didn't really get involved until around the 10th century, and there was no formal process till around the 12th century. However, St. Patrick is on the Catholic list of saints, and there is a feast day for St. Patrick, and that is largely due to the advocacy of an Irish-born Franciscan friar named Luke Wadding in the 1500s. There are a few legends of St. Patrick that are really misunderstandings, and one of the most common ones is the argument that St. Patrick freed Ireland from snakes, chased all the snakes off the island. And part of that has to do with the biological fact that there are no native snakes in Ireland. After the last ice age, it got too cold for snakes and then cut off from the continent. They never migrated back. But there were never snakes in Ireland, at least not in St. Patrick's time. Rather, that story, which was told pretty much after his death, was not meant to be taken literally. He has not chased away snakes. It was referring to the conversion of Ireland. St. Patrick was primarily responsible for chasing out the snakes, being the old pagan ways. Another interesting piece of the St. Patrick legend is that there are several accounts of him bringing people back from the dead, resurrection. And while I'm not really here to take a stand on miracles, it's quite probable that this was not really referring to literal resurrection, but again referring to the conversion of Ireland. Several people, important leaders, at first resisted Patrick even violently, but later converted to Christianity and became his friend. And that was seen as a resurrection of the soul. Those who were being resurrected were really old pagans that were being brought to the light of Christianity. Of course, one of the most persistent stories about St. Patrick is that he used the Irish shamrock as an analogy for the Holy Trinity when bringing Christianity to Ireland. And while that sounds completely plausible, we have no real contemporary record to suggest that actually happened. In fact, the first images that seemed to connect St. Patrick to shamrocks didn't come out until almost 1,200 years after his death. What's maybe more interesting is the way in which the shamrock came to represent Ireland, because it really had to do with British prejudices against the Irish. Writing in the 15 and 1600s, English botanists suggested that the Irish were wild men who would literally eat clover off the ground like cattle. And while there's no evidence that the Irish ever actually ate clover, that particular representation stuck until the shamrock came to be the symbol of Ireland. March 17th represents St. Patrick's death, and it has been celebrated as a religious holiday in Ireland at least since the 9th or 10th century, as St. Patrick came to be seen as the patron saint of Ireland. It was added to the feast calendar for the Catholic Church and the Church of Ireland in the 17th century. But in Ireland, the celebration was rather a somber religious celebration. You would go to Mass in the morning, you would celebrate a feast in the afternoon, but there were no parties, there were no parades, there was certainly no drinking of green beer, partly because the Irish as a rule don't dye their beer, but as a religious holiday, the pubs wouldn't even be open. It wasn't clear until the 1960s that pubs started to be open on St. Patrick's Day in Ireland. So how did it become the sort of wild celebration of all things Irish that we see today? The vision of a parade-driven, party-driven celebration of all things Irish really developed in the United States, which has always had a large Irish immigrant population. The first St. Patrick's Day parade in the United States was in 1766, and that was Irish soldiers in the British Army marching in New York to demonstrate their Irish heritage. And we've been holding parades here for St. Patrick's Day at least since the 1770s. Today, there's more than 100 cities in the United States that hold St. Patrick's Day parades, and the ones in Boston and New York are among the oldest civilian parades in the world. The St. Patrick's Day parade in New York generally will include 150,000 marchers in a 5-hour-long procession that will have more than 3 million people along the parade route. The popularity of St. Patrick's Day in America has a lot to do with the sheer size of the Irish American population. There are 34.5 million Americans of Irish descent, and to put that into perspective, that means that there are 7 times as many Irish Americans as there are people living in Ireland. Celebrating St. Patrick's Day with a parade is a good way for Irish Americans to recognize each other, to celebrate their history. It is a way to fight the discrimination that often came against Irish immigrants. And it is a way to show political forces how important the Irish vote is. There has been a little bit of politics involved, for example, the wearing of green. Contrary to popular belief, the connection between St. Patrick's Day and green has nothing to do with the color of the hills in Ireland. It has to do with Irish politics. The color green has represented the move for Irish independence ever since the Irish Rebellion of 1641, and increasingly emphasized the wearing of green in the United States, and even pinching people who don't wear green, which occurred in the middle of the 19th century, represented Irish American support for Irish independence. Today, the celebration of St. Patrick's Day has gone so mainstream that the political connotations have really disappeared. It's more of a broad celebration of Irish culture and immigrant culture altogether. It's celebrated now worldwide. In fact, it is celebrated in more countries than any other national holiday. Ironically, it has been the Irish that have been kind of late to come to the party. Only in the mid-1990s, as a way to support tourism, that Ireland proclaimed the National St. Patrick's Day Festival, which is now 5 days long, as a way to attract people and help represent Irish culture. But even in Ireland, it's been approached with kind of that Irish sense of humor, maybe best represented by the town of Dripsey in County Cork, which held the shortest St. Patrick's Day parade in 1999, 24 meters between the town's one pub and the town's other pub. Went on annually for 5 years until one of the pubs closed. Today, there's some criticism of St. Patrick's Day as having become too commercialized and too focused on alcohol, and it does drive somewhere on the order of $4.5 billion in business. And there are people, especially in Ireland, calling to go back to some of the religious roots of the holiday. Now, I'm not going to take a stand on that, but I am going to say that if you're celebrating today or tipping back a pint of dyed beer, maybe you should take just a few moments to consider the rich history of this holiday. I'm the History Guy. I hope you enjoyed this edition of my series, 5 Minutes of History, short snippets of forgotten history, 5 to 10 minutes long. If you enjoyed these 5 minutes and want another 5 minutes, please click like and subscribe.